we get here? Why is this mindset advancing in society? What does God say about it? What does the church say? And then how do we fight this culture of death? What do we do about it? I love this quote. I don't know how many of you have ever read or heard of Evangelium Vitae. It's a beautiful, beautiful document. It's actually very hard to not want to cut and paste the entire thing into my presentation tonight. But this particular quote from it, I think, is very fitting for our culture and our time. It says, "Without the Creator, the creature would disappear. But when God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible." And I think that as I look at the world and society and what's going on, I can see that. I just feel like there's so many things that just simply don't even make sense anymore because we've lost sight of who God is and who He is in our life. So that's kind of how I want to start it. So we look at the culture of death. What is that? We've heard of the culture of life, the culture of death. What does that mean? A culture of death is really a society that is excessively concerned with efficiency, productivity, efficiency. Very much what's happened here in America. It looks at life, any life that would require greater acceptance, love, and care as useless, as a burden, as something to be rejected. And really, it's an enemy to be resisted or eliminated. An enemy to society, to our efficiency, to our materialism, to what we want. So anything that gets in the way of that needs to be eliminated. And I'm going to reference a few times tonight, even just the idea of abortion. That's inconvenient for me, it's a burden. Or somebody that's disabled, or maybe it's an elderly, demented family member. Well, they're a burden to me, I don't have the time anymore. We just want to get rid of it. And that's really where we are today. So we first have to look at what is euthanasia. We've heard this term before. Euthanasia is an act or omission that intentionally ends the life of an incurably ill, disabled, or elderly person so that suffering or other difficulties may be eliminated. And there's kind of two different ways that this can happen. It would be a direct act or commission. So it could be lethally injecting them, it could be smothering them, shooting them. It would be a direct assault to take that life. Omission, on the other hand, is doing something, withholding or withdrawing something that would otherwise preserve life. So starving somebody to death, dehydrating them to death. We've heard that, those types of situations many times in this country. Terry Schiavo case, of course, comes to mind. And those would be withholding things that would normally not be a burden to that person. Now, John Paul II, in the document that I quoted earlier, he says that euthanasia has to be called false mercy because it's actually a disturbing perversion of mercy. And that true compassion leads to sharing in another's pain. It doesn't kill the person whose suffering we cannot bear. And I think we have to be very careful. I'm going to talk about that in another slide, but we look at sometimes mercy or compassion, and oftentimes it can be misguided. And so that's what I think he's getting at here. It's a false mercy. It's a misguided mercy that we have to be very careful of. Assisted suicide, on the other hand, is self-killing with the assistance of another. And ultimately, the final act is done by the person. So as we saw in the Brittany Maynard case, she was the one who actually took her own life with the assistance of a doctor who prescribed the final, the overdose medication. This can be assisted by a friend, a physician, relative. There's various organizations throughout this country that are trying to help people kill themselves. Again, go back to that first quote of the unintelligible. I don't even understand that anymore, but various methods, drugs, guns, plastic bag. There's groups that help you put helium in a bag and so you can suffocate yourself to death. How-to instructions, counseling, those organizations are out there trying to help you figure out how to do this. And sadly, there are 5 states here in the United States right now that this assisted suicide is legal. And that doesn't include, I haven't heard of any states that just voted on this last week in the elections, but these measures are coming up constantly in legislatures. I'm from Minnesota, and I just read that that is something that they're looking at putting on the legislative agenda for 2015. So this isn't going anywhere. And if we look at the Hippocratic Oath, which is the oath that doctors take in medical school or when they become doctors, this oath is ancient. I don't remember when he did this, if it was 2,000 years ago or what, but it's very old. It says, "I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest any such counsel." So how can medical providers be prescribing that and still be honorable to that oath? So this is also a world problem. It's actually almost, I don't want to say it's a bigger problem throughout the world, but euthanasia is actually legal in many areas of the world. This is just 3 examples. In the Netherlands, this is happening with or without the consent of the patient. So if somebody thinks your life isn't worth living, they'll just kill you. In Belgium, elderly people wear bracelets that say, "I don't want to be euthanized," because there's such a fear that if they get taken to the hospital, their life is going to be taken. These are normal occurrences in these countries. In Holland, they just voted recently to allow parents to kill their disabled children if they feel like their life isn't worth living. So these things are happening, they are in the world, and they're coming here. There's people advocating for this constantly in this country, and we have to educate ourselves to know about it. I think one of the scariest ways that they really have been pervasive in this is through terminology. So individuals can really be manipulated through the use of language. So if I would have told you at the beginning and said, is it okay for somebody to kill themselves? Probably would have said, well, no, I mean, that would be really sad if somebody wanted to do that. But if I would have said, well, do you think it's the merciful thing or the compassionate thing to let somebody who's just suffering so greatly to be able to end their life, on their own terms? Well, you might go, well, I don't know, maybe. So words that we need to be really careful of, and there's probably like 8 enters here. Death with dignity, mercy, compassion, right to die, right to choose, compassion in dying, aid in dying, quality of life, assistance, and there might be one more, freedom. Not that the word mercy or compassion is a wrong word, but if we're using it with that misguided notion, it really confuses us because we think, well, I want to be merciful, I want to be compassionate, I want to give people dignity. We all should have dignity. We're all created with dignity. And so the right to die people have really begun to twist this language and to work on our human compassion to want to give people that ability to take their own life. So as we talked about Brittany Maynard, I'm sure you've all heard of this. I don't know unless you have not turned on the internet in the last month. You probably have heard of her. 29-year-old woman with stage 4 brain cancer. She has really become the advocate for the right to die movement, and she believed it was her right to die with dignity. Somehow that if she would have let her disease take its course, there wouldn't have been dignity in her death. But I did see in an interview, she actually said, I don't want to die. So why then did she decide when she wanted to die and how she wanted to die? And sadly, she did take her life on November 1st by a legally prescribed dosage of medication. And I think a lot of us got kind of excited because right before this happened, she came out and said, well, I don't think I'm ready. I don't think I'm ready. And I think a lot of us, I was talking to people at work and they're like, prayers are working, maybe she's changing her mind. And then sadly, she did go through with it. And the question that we beg to ask is, who decides when it's no longer of value? She decided for herself, but what about those who can't make that decision? Who gets to start making that? And I think that's a question we need to keep in our mind. So we need to look at why is this even advancing? How did we get to this place? I think first and foremost is human fear. Very normal to not want to suffer, not want to have to be in pain. That's understandable. Nobody wants to suffer. And especially at the end of life. So with proper care, there are many people who die without experiencing pain. Or if pain does occur, it can be relieved safely and rapidly. We do live in a time where we have great medications that can help people to alleviate that suffering. The World Health Organization says that even the most severe cancer can be eliminated or significantly relieved. Now, of course, there's always going to be those cases of people that we just can't get their pain under control, but that generally is going to be a minority. We almost always can get their pain managed to a point that they're not going to be dying in agony. Many people are also very, very afraid of a long and lingering death due to chronic illness. We look at the fact that we are now living longer than ever before in human history. But we're living longer with chronic diseases. We're living with chronic, heart failure, with cancers, with various dementias, ALS disease, all sorts of things that it sometimes can be long and lingering, and we're in pain for a lot of years perhaps. And so people are really afraid of, I just don't want to go through that. I would rather just end this. People are also really afraid of being a burden. When we live in a society that looks at people as efficiency, productivity, are you getting in the way of me being able to pursue my career? Or, I want to go hang out with my friends today. I don't want to go visit grandma at the nursing home. When we start treating people like they're a burden, they feel like a burden, and then they don't want to put their family through a long, lingering death. So then they start thinking, well, it's the right thing to do, to take my life and not make my family go through that. And then the loss of autonomy. So we also live in a culture, America is founded on this independence, and independence is a beautiful thing. I love this country. But we have gone so far to the extreme that we don't want to have to be dependent on anybody. I want to be able to do what I want, when I want, and nobody should tell me what to do. And we really pride ourselves on not needing anybody. And that's really not what God calls us to. Man is not meant to be alone. We are meant to live in community with one another and help one another. And so this idea of autonomy really goes against what God created us for. We live in a secular culture. We really don't live much in a Christian culture anymore. The new religion, I think, is secularism. And, the idea of it's my body and it's my choice. Where have we heard that one before? We've heard that certainly with abortion. It's my body, it's my choice, it's my life. As long as I'm not hurting anybody else, I get to do what I want. And that's really the world we live in. And so we're driven by that efficiency and productivity, extreme autonomy. But the ethical religious directives, which I do a 4-hour training for staff on that. I wish I could talk about it tonight. I really can't get into it, but a beautiful document that I'm going to quote later as well. But in it says we are not the owner of our lives, and hence we don't have absolute power over life. God ultimately has power over life. He is the giver of the gift of life, and it's not ours to take. We have a financial crisis in America as the baby boomers age. As she mentioned, I have a master's in gerontology. I've studied the idea of aging, and this is, I don't even have to have a master's in this to see this, but it was something I studied a lot. And the boomer generation didn't have enough children to replace themselves. So we are reaching an inverted triangle where we have this, massive amount of older, aging people that a lot of them have chronic diseases. And then as it gets smaller and smaller, because we have less people underneath to support them, we have less people doing working and putting into Social Security. So as you maybe have heard in the news, Social Security, Medicare, all those things are dwindling because we don't have enough, there weren't enough younger generations to replace that. And so now we've got this idea of, well, how do we deal with this? Where do we put our resources? Do we put our money into helping younger people and school kids and families, and do we keep them out of poverty, or do we help the elderly stay out of poverty? So now, gosh, it's actually kind of more cost effective to support death than life with these elderly people. So you know, if you're past the age of 70 and, you know, you have a chronic disease, we might not actually help you because you can't really afford it. So those things, it sounds extreme, but it's starting to happen. And these are all ideas that are really forcing these, for people to say, well, we really maybe need to look at euthanasia, we maybe really need to look at assisted suicide. And then finally, we've really lost the meaning of suffering. Again, we don't want to suffer, and that's understandable, that's very human. But we live in a society that really sees very little value in suffering or in unproductive people. And suffering is seen as the epitome of all evil. But yet when we look at Christ, He won our freedom through suffering. We are called to unite our suffering with Him. I don't know if you've ever heard the term redemptive suffering. Again, probably a whole semester long teaching that I can't go into. But it's beautiful. The idea that we really truly can unite our suffering with Christ on the cross. And if you guys have grown up Catholic, you've probably heard, offer it up. You know, when you've got a headache or whatever, offer it up. Well, what does that mean? Well, again, it goes into the whole redemptive suffering that I don't have time to go into, but the idea that we can offer those things up. That we can say to God, I don't understand why this is happening, or this really hurts, or this really stinks, but Lord, I'm going to suffer it for you and use it however. Kind of like a gift of love somehow, like this suffering is a gift of love, and here, Lord, you have it, and give it to somebody else. And so we've lost that idea. And truly, when you are a secular culture and you no longer really believe in God, or you don't really think hell exists, or, you know, all those things, when you get to that secularism, you know, what is the point of suffering then? If there's no point in it, why should we do it? And that's the scary part about how we've really lost our Christian identity as a country and in Europe as well. So back to Brittany, Compassionate Choices is the Right to Die movement. I believe they were the Hemlock Society. And I really think they used Brittany to change the face of assisted suicide. You know, people look at assisted suicide, euthanasia, and they've always kind of thought about elderly, or they think, well, I don't know, they maybe didn't have a strong opinion, but then they hear her story. And they see her pictures of her with her puppy, or they see her with her husband on her wedding day, and they think, oh my gosh, this poor woman, and she's so young, and she's going to suffer. And she's changed the face of it. Because now when you hear assisted suicide, you think of Brittany. You don't think of some elderly person with terminal cancer, you think of Brittany. And what pressure this woman must have been under. She decided to go public with this. She decided to be the fundraising guru for the Right to Die movement. And how many people were congratulating her on her courage. You're so courageous to want to do this and to be so public. And what pressure? If she wanted to change her mind, did she have the freedom to change her mind when the world was watching her? I mean, these articles and these videos were all over the world. This isn't just America watching this. And we have no idea what miracles she was robbed of, what miracles her family was robbed of. I can't imagine the guilt that they may end up feeling someday because they didn't stop it. They let her do this. I mean, I work in hospice, and I'm not clinical, so I don't work directly in the clinical side, but we hear stories all the time of amazing, beautiful, miraculous things that happen at the end of life. Relationships that are mended, or relationships with God that are fixed or reconciled. And when you decide to take your life when you want it, you're robbing yourself, you're robbing your loved ones, you're robbing God of an opportunity to work in your life or the life of someone else. You're also robbing, in this case, her family's opportunity to rally around her and love her in her most vulnerable time in life. That's what family does, that's what loved ones do, that's what we do as a Christian community. And she was really robbed of that opportunity as well. And again, I come back to the fact that this is really a violation of the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Death is not a treatment. Poor Brittany was really treated as a disease. You know, she wasn't, I feel like she wasn't looked at as a person. And, you start looking at what are we doing in this culture? We're putting people down like you would an animal. I mean, it's the as they're giving these I think it's barbiturates, I can't remember the term, but it's not really unlike what we would do to an animal to put them down. We're allowing people to starve or dehydrate to death. Do you know that it's legal in all 50 states to let someone starve or dehydrate to death who's terminal? Pull their feeding tube. Don't give them water. They're dying anyway. That's legal, but it's euthanasia. And so we are treating people, I mean, if there was a farmer who was starving his cattle to death, he'd be arrested. And PETA or somebody else would be there rescuing those animals, and yet we allow people with souls to go through this. It just makes absolutely no sense. And it's really all in the name of choice. The freedom that we all think we deserve, the right that we think we have. And so we have to look at, what does God say? What does the church say? Catechism says that those who are, their lives are diminished or weakened deserve special respect. And that direct euthanasia is morally unacceptable under any circumstances. It's God who remains the sovereign master of life. We are obligated to accept life gratefully and preserve it for His honor and for the salvation of our souls. So, we do not get to decide when life ends. God does. Because we don't know what is in the plan and what opportunities are there at the end for us or for our loved ones. Oftentimes suffering is not even, yes, it's for us, but it can be an opportunity for others to grow in virtue and in character. Because if we eliminate suffering, how do we grow? How do we love those? If we eliminated all the poor and all the sick people in the world, we'd be really selfish. There would be no opportunity for us to grow or to extend ourselves beyond what we want. Suicide is a contradiction of the natural inclination. It offends love of neighbor because it unjustly breaks the ties of solidarity with family, our nation, and other human societies. It's contrary to the love of the living God. The ethical and religious directives. If there's anybody that is in medical anything, I encourage everybody to read this document, but in particular if you're pursuing anything in medicine, absolutely important that you read this. But I do believe everybody needs to read it. It is what I train on. It's a beautiful document that helps us to know the ethics that we need to treat people within healthcare. And in it says we are not the owners of our lives, and hence we do not have the absolute power over life. Suicide and euthanasia are never morally acceptable options. Back to this document. Again, another one that I very much encourage all of you to read. It says, none of us lives, this is the Bible verse, none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. So dying to the Lord means experiencing one's death as a supreme act of obedience to the Father. Being ready to meet death at the hour willed and chosen by Him, by God. Further, John Paul II said that suffering can always become a source of good. Like I said, this is an opportunity for people to grow in virtue and in character, as well as the opportunity to offer that suffering up for the love of your family, the world. We can offer that up, and it's very, very real. It says that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God, and that to assist in another's suicide is to take part in an injustice which can never be excused, even if it is requested. So these are strong words, giving us very clear answers. A statement by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops says that life is our first gift from an infinitely loving Creator. It is the most fundamental element of our God-given human dignity. In a society that devalues some people's lives by hastening and facilitating their deaths, will ultimately lose respect for other rights and freedoms. And I want to just mention, sorry, somehow in my mind I was going to go page by page, but I have not done that. Talking about the idea that this personal autonomy is being used to justify voluntary assisted suicide and euthanasia. But in the countries that have done that, the physicians have moved on to take the lives of adults who've never asked to die. And newborn children who have no choice in the matter. And the idea that suffering caused by chronic and terminal illness, they're often severe. That's very real. The cry out for our compassion, or they cry out for our compassion, and the word compassion actually means to suffer with another person. So true compassion alleviates suffering while maintaining solidarity with those who suffer. It doesn't put lethal drugs in their hands and abandons them to suicidal impulses. It helps vulnerable people with their problems instead of treating them as the problem. John Paul II, when he was here for World Youth Day in 1993, said that the culture of death has assumed a social and institutional form of legality to justify the most horrible crimes against humanity. We can see that. Abortion, euthanasia. And you can see biblically, Satan is referred to as the dragon, the ruler of the world, father of lies. He tries relentlessly to eradicate from human hearts the sense of gratitude and respect for the original, extraordinary, and fundamental gift of life, which is human life itself. And we can see that struggle today. And we're on a slippery slope. We now live in a society that worships animals and creation. I don't even understand why someone would have a sign like that. Why would we kill ourselves to save the planet? It doesn't make any sense to me. Again, coming back to how we are becoming irrational, incomprehensible. We've turned on ourselves. We're contracepting ourselves out of existence almost. We are aborting at just an alarming rate worldwide, and now euthanasia. It's coming. And it's so against what God called us to at the very beginning of time. He said, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over all of these things. And yet somehow we've decided that that's not what he meant. It doesn't make sense. The slippery slope comes back to this question, who decides when life is no longer of value? In the case of Brittany, she decided it wasn't. What about these disabled children who their parents are saying, well, this life isn't worth living anymore? Who gets to decide that? How do we know that that person that's deciding that doesn't somehow have an investment in that? Maybe it's mom or dad and they have, a great amount of money and I'd like to go on a trip or I'd like a new house, so maybe we should just kill them so that I can get my money. I mean, who decides what is of value? And I really actually hate the term quality of life, which is often used at end of life. Well, they don't have any quality of life anymore. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? That they're not productive or they're efficient? Life always has quality because we are made in the image and likeness of God. And so who gets to decide that? Abortion was the gateway. So when you can start taking innocent life, then I guess who's to stop you from deciding you can kill grandma or that you yourself no longer want to live because you just don't like your life anymore, or you're imagining what your disease is going to look like and you're assuming the worst, and so you get to decide that. And really once we allow abortion in, who's to stop all these other atrocities against life? We're seeing that elderly, mentally ill, demented people, we put them away in facilities. They're inconvenient to our busy lives, and they're often seen as a drain of resources. I don't know when the last time, if you guys have any loved ones in a nursing home, but visit them. They'll go days, maybe weeks without somebody visiting them. And that's just sad. And so we were just so busy write them a letter, do something, because someday that might be you sitting in there and having nobody to visit you, and it's just really sad to me. So again, when life is no longer fundamentally good, when we no longer think life is a good and it's a gift from God, who gets to decide that? So what do we do? How do we fight this? John Paul II, again, I quote this quite a lot. He says, "Have courage to look the truth in the eye and call things by their proper name." Call it what it is. It's not death with dignity, it's euthanasia, it's assisted suicide, it's taking your own life. It's not death with compassion, it's not. We need to start using the terms that they really are, because it's that pervasive that is perpetuating this culture as we go. John Paul II, before he was even Pope, looks like 1976, he says, "We're standing in the face of the greatest historical confrontation humanity has gone through. We are now facing the final confrontation between the church and the anti-church, of the gospel and the anti-gospel." And, I think we need to be really aware of that this is bigger than us. This is a spiritual battle. But we need to take courage, because we know that in the end God wins. But we do need to be aware that this is bigger than us. It's bigger than a political battle. Now you're all probably going to think, "Oh, she's crazy. She's starting to talk about the devil." But he's real. He's real. And one of the things with the secular culture, and I think one of Satan's probably greatest victories, is he's convinced a lot of people he doesn't exist. And the Bible refers to him 118 times under various names. He's real. He exists, and he's trying to steal souls. That's reality. And we don't like to think about that. We like to just think that, there really isn't a hell and everybody's fine, and as long as you are a nice person, you're good. And the reality is that's exactly what Satan wants. He wants us to not think he exists, or to think that lukewarm is good enough. And I just read this week that there's a concern amongst Catholic exorcists, because they've noticed an increase in demonic activity all over the world. These things are happening, and it's happening because people are opening themselves up to, because they don't think Satan exists, and they think, "Oh, Ouija boards are fine, and I'm just gonna I'm just curious," and you're opening yourself up to really, being really influenced by evil. And I think, again, when we don't believe he exists, we've opened the door for him to get in. And we have to always remember that this has to be fought in prayer. This is a spiritual battle, and the only way, we have to do what we can to fight legally, legislatively, all of those things, but we also need to pray. That's what we need. So again, speak the truth. Call sin, sin. Call euthanasia, euthanasia. That's what it is. We need to engage in dialogue. And the executive director of the Catholic Conference in Minnesota said that the best way to counter the strong cultural and political push to advance the culture of death under the false guise of patient autonomy is to tell stories witnessing to the beauty of life at all stages, even in difficult circumstances where sometimes great suffering is present. And I'm going to tell you that when my grandma passed away, she was 90, very devout Catholic woman, and she suffered greatly for about 7 weeks before she died, and it was an undiagnosed diabetic condition that exposed her sciatic nerve, and it was horrible to visit her because she was in so much pain. And she could have very easily said, "I just want to take something and be done with this," but she didn't. She was a beautiful Catholic woman, and that experience changed my life, because I was able to be with her in that suffering. I was able to be with her on her deathbed. I was able to pray with her. I was able to make sure a priest got there to give her her blessing. I walked in it was just after midnight. I had laid down to take a nap, and I was going to go up at 3 in the morning to pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at her bedside. And we got the call that we better get back to the hospital. And couldn't find my rosary. And so we were delayed by a few minutes, and then we got there, and the emergency doors were locked, and so we had to go around, and we missed her last breath by about probably 15 seconds. But she was there with the oldest granddaughter. But I have never felt a stronger spiritual experience in my entire life. I knew without a doubt in my mind that room was full of saints and angels. And I loved my grandma, and I have never cried because I knew where she was. And she gave me that gift by allowing us to love her in her suffering. And so there is beauty in suffering. There is. And it certainly wasn't an easy road for her. She was in a lot of pain. But she allowed me to experience something I had never experienced before and I've never experienced since. But I do remember thinking, if this is what heaven feels like, I am ready to go. I can't explain it, but to say that was the most beautiful spiritual experience I've ever had. And that was her allowing us to love her in her suffering. We also need to really read and understand these issues. So, some of these documents that I've referenced, if you are interested in what they are, you can let me know afterwards. I can email them to you or whatever, or I can give them to Sarah. But we have to understand these things. Again, there's so many end-of-life issues: nutrition and hydration, proper pain medication, informed consent. There's so many things, advanced directives, all these things that I can't even touch on tonight. But they're important, and they're important for you. If you're 18 or older, they're important to you because you are now an adult, and these they're not necessarily you're not under your parents' guardianship anymore. So you need to understand these things and be an advocate for your loved ones. In my family, most of my family has fallen away from the faith. Had I not asked to have a priest come in for my grandma, who's a devout Catholic, I don't know that one would have. So you need to be the advocate for your loved ones. Protect yourself with an advanced directive. You think, oh gosh, I'm not old enough to have one of those, but anybody that's 18 or older should have an advanced directive that indicates somebody that can make medical decisions for you if you ever were unable to make them for yourself. And it probably will be your parent, but maybe not. Maybe you have, maybe Father John can do it for all of you. I'm just kidding. You want to pick somebody that understands the faith, that's going to make good decisions, that isn't going to say, you know what, let's just pull the feeding tube, let her starve to death because she wouldn't want to live this way anyway. You don't want that. You want somebody that's going to make a good decision for you. I also just suggest live your values at work. If you can, find a job, find a place where that really supports your values. There's a lot of great companies out there. There's a lot of companies who are doing not so good things. And that's not really related to end of life, but yet it is. We want to be in a culture of life. We want to work to build up the kingdom of God, and that includes where we spend our time in the workplace. Use Catholic organizations and healthcare providers if at all possible. You can look them up online. Try to use NFP providers if you're, a female, family planning, any of those things. People that are going to support good Catholic ethics. And then advocate for your loved ones. You need to be the voice for them. Recognize that there is dignity in every single human person. No one should ever be looked at as a disease or as a burden. Everyone has dignity. We are created in the image and likeness of God. And that suffering are very real, and they do require us to assist. Even at this point in life, maybe it's not a terminal cancer, but maybe you know someone that's suffering from depression or anxiety or diabetes or something. We can always help the suffering. And remember that anybody that's requesting euthanasia really needs to be receiving loving care, psychological, spiritual support, and appropriate remedies for pain and symptoms. We need to let them die naturally of their own cause. And then finally realize once again, this is a battle between good and evil. This started in the Garden of Eden. This has been going on for a very long time. euthanasia, infanticide, all those things have happened before in history. Praise God, the Christian world came into being and kind of pulled those things out of history for a while, but they're back. This is a battle, and we need to recognize that. Stay close to the church. She's not going to lead you astray. She's been around for 2,000 years. She's wiser than everybody else. Just please rely on the church to guide you on these things, and don't be swayed by that pervasive terminology and kind of the twist that they're trying to do to our hearts of misusing our compassion. Have hope in Christ. He wins the battle. We know how the book ends. We know that we're on the winning side. So hang in there, fight the fight, because we need to fight the fight, but also know that, don't give up hope. And God is always there to give miracles and win battles for us when we don't think that we're going to win. And pray. All these things can be overcome eventually through prayer. Don't give up hope, and just pray. Just pray. So those are a few of I think I got them all in there, but I think that was some of them. So, do I have questions, or do we take a break? Christ suffered, and through his suffering, gave us the ultimate gift of love. He gave us the opportunity to be with him in heaven. And so, it is through our suffering. God is outside of time, right? So, we can, in many ways, be there with him on the cross. We can unite our sufferings with his. I'm blanking on the Bible verse from St. Paul who says he makes up for what is lacking in the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And it's not to say that Christ's sacrifice wasn't complete, because it was, but that he gave us the gift to participate in it. And so, this is a really dorky way to try to explain it, but I think of it as, if I'm suffering and I can joyfully accept it, not, I hate suffering, I'm offering this up. Because that's not really lovingly accepting your suffering, but to say, I don't understand this. This hurts. I'm in pain. I'm afraid it's never going to end. But Lord, I know that there's a reason for it, and I'm gonna accept this, and I'm going to ask that you use this suffering. Let's say it's for Sarah, who is, maybe she's sick with a flu. And I kind of think of it as like little love bubbles, like all these little bubbles are, little heart-shaped bubbles are going up. And God takes them and he brings them back down on you as blessings. They're not, my suffering doesn't become someone else's suffering. My suffering becomes a gift of love that I can offer to someone else. So there's many people who actually at the end of life will choose to not use pain medication. They will choose to feel that pain as severely as they can because they want to unite themselves with Christ. There is no suffering on the face of this planet that is equivalent to what Christ experienced on the cross. And so there are people who will choose redemptive suffering at the end of life to withhold medication and to unite that suffering with Christ. And it may be for the redemption of their own sins. It may be for their own family. Maybe it's the conversion of their children who have left the faith. It could be for the world, for the end of abortion or euthanasia. Those are powerful things, and the idea of redemptive suffering has been around probably for 2,000 years. It's been around for a long time. It's a Catholic practice. It doesn't mean that there aren't other religions who do it, but it's primarily a Catholic tradition. You can look at it, and if I'm boring you, you can start raising your hands and I'll go on to the next question, but we can think of it as fasting as well. So Christ talks about how fast and pray. So when you fast, pray, and it's more powerful somehow because we're having mastery over ourselves. Well, what happens at Lent when you give up coffee, or you give up chocolate, or you give up snacking in between meals? It hurts. It stinks. I'm hungry. I'm craving chocolate, whatever it is. That's suffering, and yet we do it, and there's power in that because we've mastered our own desires, our own wants wants and our needs, and we do it for Christ. And we can harness that and say, I am going to do this, Lord, and I'm going to do it for you, and I'm going to do it for whatever intention. And so Christ calls us to that fasting and that praying. And so in the sense of those who are choosing redemptive suffering, it's kind of like an extreme form of a fast, where they're taking on an extreme suffering that goes far beyond giving up chocolate. Does that kind of help?
I think that was awesome. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think so.
I'm sorry.
It's a great topic.
Okay, unless you're going to tell me.
Catherine did a great job explaining it. She's much more wise on this topic than I am. But I just wanted to give like a personal experience of kind of doing something very similar. And thanks to Father John, he's got me taking all these cold showers as like a suffering, like, hey, I'm fast, but like turn the shower on cold and just sit there and freeze to death. So during Lent, I did that like 2 to 3 times a week, this spring of 2014. And I would just, before I get my shower, be like, Father, I offer my suffering up for a starving child in Africa, or one of my friends that's suffering more than I am. And I actually call a few of my friends to do the same. I would like talk to my cousin Josh and be like, hey, before you get in the cold shower, just like offer it up for someone else that's suffering more than you. So just brought up those memories. So I'm glad you have some questions here, and so ask Catherine more about it. Thanks.
That's the first time I've ever heard the cold shower suffering. I like it. That's good. I saw another hand somewhere.
Do you ever hand her first?
Yes. So, what is the Catholic view on donation?
Organ donation. Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's a tough one. Okay. So, the ethical religious directives encourage helping those who are wanting to do organ donation to help them. John Paul II said that organ donation is a great gift of love. So the church is in support of organ donation. I will tell you that there is a lot of debate going on about organ donation and what is brain death. There is concern that how do you really know when someone's truly brain dead? How do you know when their soul has left the body or not? There's a lot of confusion on it. So the short answer is the church is very much in support of it. The long answer is there's a lot of ethicists and theologians and all those smarter people than I am that are debating this. You'll often find within some of the pro-life circles that are, I don't want to say a little more militant, but they're definitely a little more cautious. They definitely are advocating to not, because they're nervous that the person may not actually be dead. Because you hear stories where people's heart can be started after 5 or 6 minutes. I think 5 minutes right now is the cutoff when someone dies. You have to have the organs started to be harvested within 5 minutes. And so there are actually some advocates now who are pushing for 2 minutes or so because those organs are so valuable. They don't want to risk losing any of them, and we know people can come back from that. So there's this is, I think, going to become a bigger issue, especially as we talk about the lack of resources and what do we do? Organs are in short supply. So the short answer is church is in support of it, but just know that there's a bigger debate going on right now as science continues.
All right, so when people decide to take their own life, or assisted suicide itself, or euthanasia, I think it's the same thing, but do they go to like hell because obviously like they didn't have a chance to like talk to God and like get forgiven like for their sins, and like so do they go to hell, or like what happens?
That's a difficult question.
Okay.
Because we don't know. We actually don't know. We believe in a merciful and loving God, and we have to leave them in the hands of God and pray for their soul. We know that God tells us that this is not okay, But we also know that for many people who decide to commit suicide, maybe they're not terminally ill, maybe they're extremely depressed and they decide to commit suicide. That's a mental illness as well. And I know this issue certainly came up with Robin Williams, and there's a lot of debate over whether, is this a selfish choice, all those things. And, I certainly am not the person to say whether someone's in hell or not. We just need to pray for them and know that God is the only one who really can know where they were. Is it possible they could be? They could be. We know that. They very possibly rejected God at the end of life, and ultimately that's what hell is. It's a rejection of God. So I can't certainly answer that, but it's a possibility.
Thank you.
All right, this is a long one. I'm
Okay.
trying to get it out with a.
Okay.
Okay.
Microphone, or you
No, that's fine. That's in my face too. Okay. So you mentioned at the end there that, or you mentioned at the beginning that removing the feeding tube was basically kind of considered murder. Removing the feeding tube, allowing someone to starve, allowing someone to dehydrate, and then you said in the end we have to go to, we have to try to preserve life. So, to what extent do we actually have to try to preserve life? Is it considered suicide when you won't accept treatment, such as we're getting to the point where we can now 3D print organs out of stem cells out of your own body. So, to what extent can we replace organs? I mean, your entire body is an organ. So your skin is an organ, inside everything. So to what extent can we go replacing organs? I mean, what if you do a brain transplant into a brand new body? And then all that, how do we deem what's natural and unnatural? And I think that's kind of where we cut the line, is saying like, oh, this is natural, this is what the body needs to survive. But I mean, granted, the body needs a heart to survive. So do we have to go to that extent? And also. It keeps going on. So, and then it would go into the point where, okay, well, is it considered suicide if you don't accept treatment? What about somebody that doesn't accept staying healthy? Is that considered suicide, that you're allowing your body to become, what you're basically killing yourself, causing yourself to die earlier? Is that? I understand we don't want to consider that to be on the same line as taking pills. But is it not the same thing? You're picking your date to die. You're not doing everything you can. So to what extent do we actually have to attempt to preserve life?
Holy smokes. James Tillman, everybody.
So this is actually kind of more where I was going to take the talk originally until Father John asked me to change subjects. So first question, more about feeding tubes, nutrition, hydration. I'm glad you asked that, because I certainly don't want anybody to leave this room today and say removing a feeding tube is always immoral and wrong and it's always euthanasia, because it's not. I don't have my DRD booklet with me. I can't believe I don't. I should have. The Ethical Religious Directives, I'm going to just step back a second and tell you that is a document that gives us 72 directives in total that help us to know how to make ethical decisions within medicine. ERD number 58 in particular addresses nutrition and hydration. And it says that food and water, nutrition and hydration, are ordinary means in most cases. We always need to presume food and water for people. However, the way that we decide medical treatment is really looking at benefit versus burden. So if the burden of that treatment outweighs the benefit, it becomes extraordinary. It becomes really optional. It also, in that ERD number 58, talks about how it is okay to remove a feeding tube when it has become a burden to someone, or if it's no longer going to preserve life or it's causing suffering. So I can tell you what happens at the end of life is the body begins to shut down. Organs begin to shut down because the energy is being drawn into kind of just like the minimal amount of organs needed to stay alive. So the digestive system shuts down. So if you have a feeding tube that's pushing food into your digestive system, or an IV with fluids, but your body can't process those things, it actually can become very painful. The liquids, the fluids can actually begin to swell around the heart and could cause heart failure. So there is a certain point in the dying process for sure where those things actually really should be removed because it can be more painful for that person when they're dying. However, if a person is not actively dying and we know that a feeding tube would help them live longer and make them more comfortable, then we really do need to look at that. It gets tricky with dementia patients because they're often very, very confused about, if you have a tube in their stomach, they don't know what that is and they'll try to pull it out. So there's a lot of debate over the ethics of what do you do in that situation, because we certainly don't want anybody to starve to death. It's actually very painful to dehydrate or starve to death. However, it could potentially be more of a burden for that person because they're confused, they're pulling it out, and now we might get an infection, all those types of things. So I can tell you that ethics, what I have learned through this job, through my certification, is ethics have to be decided in particular circumstances. I can't sit here and say it is always right or it is always wrong to do such and such in this type of situation. I can tell you that generally speaking, we need to always presume in favor of food and water. We need to always preserve life to the best of our ability. However, we have to look at each individual situation and decide the benefit versus burden. And that burden actually needs to be decided by the patient. So we could have somebody who's on dialysis. And maybe that dialysis, that kidney dialysis has been working for them. And it's helping them, and they're feeling pretty good. But then suddenly, things change. It becomes where they have to go every day, and maybe it's an hour to get to the hospital, and they're starting to just really be in a lot of pain. Suddenly that treatment is now becoming a burden. And so it's okay for them to say no. But again, you have to look at each individual situation.
Okay, so, in the case of...
By the way, I think you need to go into bioethics and see if you have questions.
Go into what?
Bioethics or something, with your questions.
No, I'm going into engineering.
I was warned this would be a lot of engineers.
So, you said that, that removing the water tube is, in certain cases is okay, but is that not the exact same thing? What happens if someone with terminal brain cancer says, this has become a burden, this disease has become a burden, I can't handle it anymore, or if they decide to stop drinking water and it takes 10 days, it's still, what is 10 days versus, 20 minutes taking a drug? I mean, technically time is linear, it doesn't matter really, dear God, when you die.
It's good to have a camera on.
No, it feels terrible. But what I mean? So it's a decision still either way. It's a decision by a person, by a human being, and not by God.
Well, and ultimately, God gives us free will. Ultimately, you can make that choice. But again, it comes back to, now we just got to walk away, his question of, we're talking about our salvation, we're talking about our souls. So if God tells us, and the church tells us, it's not okay to take your life, and we decide to take it anyway, we're running the risk of our salvation. So ultimately, yes, you have the freedom to say, I'm going to dehydrate to death, I'm going to starve to death, and I personally can't really stop you. If it was me doing our medical treatment, we would, at a hospice, we would look at an ethics committee and say, what do we do? Well, this person is essentially committing suicide. What do we do? Because ultimately it is their decision. In some cases, it may be something where we actually have to take them off service because we don't want to have part in that. We cannot help somebody kill themselves. But in the case of, maybe it's somebody who just genuinely isn't hungry. Their cancer has started to really take over and they're not hungry. Is that wrong if they're not eating? No, they're not hungry. We can offer food, we can offer water, we can offer those things, but ultimately, it really comes to your intention. Are you are you trying to kill yourself, or are you just genuinely, this is a burden and I'm not hungry, or I'm really not thirsty, or whatever. I appreciate your question, and I don't know that I feel like I'm beating around the bush to try to answer it. But at the end of the day, the church, God has really given us the avenue of how to treat our lives, but we do have the free will to reject that.
If you had more time, where would you look for the answer? Like, would you go to the Catechism, something like that? Does the church have writings about kind of what I said? I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot,
No,
trying to make you answer the question.
Writing more about specifically which, because you asked me.
I guess not the specific question. I asked a lot of questions.
Give
But
which one?
does the church have a concise, looking for like a novel just about this topic, about whether or not just about whether or not kind of what you talked about and everything that you said, and to what extent do we have to go? I mean,
Right. It really comes down to ordinary means, extraordinary means. I would recommend reading the Ethical Religious Directives.
Okay.
It's not a huge document. It's actually a really beautiful document. I like it. I'm supposed to tell you could go buy it from the USCCB, but you actually can look it up and get a PDF for free and print it off. So you're college students, I'm going to tell you that, just print it off. I would start there. I think, I don't know if that's going to fully answer your question. Start there. But I'm seriously more than happy to give you my email address if you, I will send, I think I can never say the name. Evangelium, there it is, Evangelium Vitae. Notice I only said it once during my presentation because I can't say it very well. That's a beautiful document about euthanasia, assisted suicide, abortion. That may be another good one to start with. There's actually so many documents that I'm not even sure where to point you, but I would start with that. Religious directives.
let's start with the last one. The last one's going to be prayer.
Oh! Yeah.
Can I just add a comment? I think what I noticed in the distinction that in your words that you made was, when does life become a burden and when does treatment become a burden? And like, for someone to say that like by taking a drug, that's like to like end their life, that's saying life is too much of a burden. Whereas like taking treatment or like away, or deciding to opt for suffering at the end of life as opposed to treatment, I think is what like I noticed, that there is a distinction in that. And like in there lies the like moral issue, I think, of when is like it okay and not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that clarification, because that is actually what we really need to look at, is when we look at benefit versus burden, the person can never be considered the burden. It's the treatment, it's the medication, it's the, maybe it's their particular living situation, whatever it is. Those things can be the burden that we need to judge, or we need to try to fix or whatever, but the person can never be considered a burden.
Or the disease itself. I mean, as harmful as it is, like, the burden isn't like what makes it a value of life or not.
Life is
Like,
always
that's
a value, and we need to always keep that in mind. So, these are hard issues. Again, it comes back to nobody wants to suffer. Nobody wants to go through these things. And when we lose sight of the value of life, and when we lose sight of really God, we get confused about what are we supposed to do. And so I'm just so grateful that you guys are all here tonight. And I'm not trying to cut myself off if there's more questions, but I hope that you walk away with another insight into this, because I've been amazed, particularly with the Brittany Maynard situation. I've seen at least 3 articles, and I haven't even searched for them, of people who have the same brain cancer who are choosing to fight. One of them is a seminarian out on the East Coast, and he's in seminary. I actually know someone personally who had that same brain cancer. She ended up getting some treatment down in Mexico at an alternative clinic down there, and she's lived like 9 years now. There are people within hospice. Father John wanted me to touch on hospice, and I know I'm over time, so I really probably shouldn't, but there are people that, now I just lost my train of thought. People that live longer than they're supposed to. To be on hospice, you're supposed to have 6 months or less if your disease ran the normal course. There's people that have been on hospice for 2 years. We don't know when God's going to take life. And so it's really been interesting and beautiful to me to see different people coming forth saying, I have this too, but I'm choosing to fight, or I'm choosing to allow this suffering and allow my family to be a part of it. And so I just encourage you really to look at the other side, because I think this Brittany Maynard situation has really kind of been thrown at us. And if you don't look at both sides, I think it's very easy to kind of get sucked into this story and feel like, yeah, that is the right thing, we should make it legal. So I just encourage you to really look at the other perspective and look at really what has God called us to. So I'm over my 8:30 time. Do you want me to shut up?
Yes.
Anybody else have any burning questions?
More than welcome to continue asking questions, as long as that's okay with you, Catherine.
Yeah.
But please, I mean, if you need to leave, but.
James, you got any more?
Thanks a lot for coming, everybody.
I'm not going to look on this side of the room anymore.
That's the churches do do not resuscitate for us. People haven't gotten any food.
He just asked, what's the church's view on the do not resuscitate order? I'm not aware of a specific statement on the DNR. The DNR has its place, particularly if someone is, very terminally ill. CPR can be very tough on a person if they're already very frail and terminal. It can break their cage, puncture a lung, they can end up on a ventilator and probably end up suffering and dying within a couple days or so anyway. So there is a time and a place for a DNR. The challenge is if people are choosing a DNR really before they need the DNR. I don't know if that, I'm just trying to think of, I read an article by the NCBC recently, the National Catholic Bioethics Center. I'm trying to remember exactly what they said with that, but ultimately, again, it comes down to, ethical decisions need to be made really in the moment. So if you're filling out a directive that says, I never want a feeding tube, I never want antibiotics, I never want to be resuscitated, but you're actually pretty healthy when you make that decision, that's not actually the best thing, because you have to make those ethical decisions in that moment, because maybe you go in for some sort of a surgery and you come out and you're weak and you need a vent for 2 days. That's it, 2 days. But you have said, I never want a vent. Will they give you the vent? I don't know. They might not, because you said, I never want one. And so we have to be very careful of saying, I never want this or I never want that. So DNRs, and if you want more information, I probably can find something better than my ramblings right now, but there is a time and a place for it, but we just have to make sure that we're not doing it way too early. For somebody that's relatively healthy, it might actually be fine to be revived, but if someone is pretty frail, that would be frail or already in a terminal condition. That is when it is okay. Usually people on hospice become a DNR because they already probably are within the last months or weeks of life, that if their heart does stop, we're just going to let them go peacefully at that time.
I have another question. Okay. I was just wondering, what does euthanasia mean, like the term? Because it's like, sounds like youth, but obviously it is not spelled Y-O-U-T-H.
It means good death,
Okay.
and it's kind of been hijacked.
Okay.
Yeah, it's Greek for good death. Yeah.
No, I guess, because you work with a lot of the patients and their families.
Do I? I don't. That's the one thing I'm so bummed out about my job, because I actually really love praying by the bedside of people who are dying. I do more education and training with our staff and with the community, like being here. This has been really fun. And then I do ethics committees and things like that. So I unfortunately don't, because I'm not a clinical member. I don't get to hang out with families. But did you have a specific question around that?
I just, how do people that work, and how do they not really get to that?
How do you not let it get to you if you work in hospice? The best way I can answer that is, I like kids, but I would die after one day in a daycare. If you are called to hospice, you are called to hospice. Like I said, I had that experience with my grandma that was so profound. And then about 3 years ago, one of my very closest friends' mom died of cancer at the age of 60, whatever. And I happened to be in the room when that happened. And I actually felt so guilty because I was so energized by it. Not because I'm rejoicing in death, because it is such a sacred time. And to be able to be there and support them, to pray with this patient as they're dying, to pray them into the next life, to hug my friend who was weeping over his mother's body, was such an honor for me to be there. And so I actually stopped the social worker because my friend's mom had only gotten to this hospice that morning. She was already unconscious, and she died literally within like 6 hours of being there. And the nurses were bawling. They had never met this woman before, and they were bawling. And I was, horribly sad. And it's so hard to hear somebody weeping and to know that their mother is gone. But I left, and I had to stop the social worker, and I said, "What is wrong with me? The nurses are bawling, and they don't even know her, and I'm just so honored to be here." And she said, "It just means you have the capacity to hold the emotion. It doesn't mean you're a bad person." And so it doesn't mean that I don't feel. It doesn't mean that I don't, that it doesn't get to me. To some extent, you do. It becomes more normal to you. But you are energized by it because you enjoy the opportunity of helping people. Helping them have that dignity in their last days. Loving them, supporting them, encouraging them, helping those family members who are grieving. You are called to this work. I think people that are not called to hospice don't make it in hospice. They won't last. But a lot of times we hear hospice nurses that have been doing it for 30 years. And they're some of the sweetest people. They're not callous, they're not rude, they're not rough with patients. They are so gentle and loving because they are called to that ministry. I think that that's truly the difference, is they're called to it. Because like I said, I couldn't last a day in a daycare. I literally would go nuts. So, and it doesn't mean I don't like kids, it just means that it's not where I'm called. So. Oh no!
So we talked about whether or not the treatment is considered a burden. Who decides whether or not it's considered a burden? Because I was over in Haiti doing a mission trip, and over there it's considered a burden to treat kids under 4 years old for worms, because the mortality rate is, I think it's like 25 or 30% for children under 4. Yet over here, if you have enough money, such as in the case of Walt Disney, you can freeze yourself at the end of life, so that
Did Walt Disney freeze himself?
I don't know if that's a rumor or not, but I know people.
I've heard that too.
But no, I think he might have. That or he froze his brain.
He's with Elvis.
Oh, dear Lord.
JFK.
But yeah. So, who gets to decide whether or not it's a burden? Because clearly that's a societal thing. We've come up with that, and God has had obviously influence on society, but I hope to God not that much.
The burden is actually, according to the ethical religious directives, the burden is decided by the patient or their decision maker. So if somebody is unable to make that decision. However, the expectation is you are making that decision in the best interest of the patient, and again, not considering the personal burden. So here's a kind of an extreme example, but let's imagine we have two gentlemen who have some sort of throat cancer, and they have been told, you know what, you have 3 weeks left to live. But then the next week they suddenly say, you know what, if we remove part of your jaw and part of your tongue, you're going to get an extra 6 weeks of life. Ooh. Okay, so let's, the first gentleman might say, no, thank you. That sounds absolutely horrific. Not only would I not even be able to probably eat, that's horribly painful, it's deforming. No, that is such a burden to me. That burden outweighs the benefit of the 6 weeks. That's so horrific, I can't even imagine that. I'm going to decline that. The second guy might say, you know what, my daughter's getting married in 5 weeks, and I really want to be there. I'm willing to do that. And so for him, the benefit outweighs the burden. So that's why we have to be careful that we're making those decisions. We're making those decisions in the moment with all the information. So yes, ultimately somebody could make the decision to want to kill themselves because they're going to say, well, the burden is too great. But that's where, particularly as a Catholic health organization, we need to make sure that the decision really needs to be made with informed consent. So do they fully understand their prognosis, their risk, the treatment options, the cost? Do they understand all of those elements? Are they making this decision in a sound mind, or are they making it out of a very depressed place? Do they feel like a burden? And that's where we ultimately have to look at, the quote about when someone is looking for euthanasia, we need to meet them with love. We need to meet them with proper spiritual and psychological care, because they might be making that decision because they see that none of their family wants to visit them. And they're like, well, then what's the point of my life? So we have to, as a medical community, help them also to make that decision. But in the end, it is up to them to decide what is a burden or not.